Hey guys, what is up? Super K-Man Rocks here, and I am here for my LCS lower bracket round 1, upper bracket round 2 overview and analysis video here in the summer playoffs or the LCS championship, whatever you want to classify it as. We are here to cover the 3 series that happened this past weekend. Yes, 3 best of 5s instead of the normal 2, and with that being said, because it's 3, this is going to be a bit of a longer video, so I don't want to waste you guys' time too much at the beginning. If you do want to check out my analysis on the upper bracket round 1, how we got here, check out the video up in the iCard. Up there as well is going to be the playlist for every single video I've made on the LCS in the summer split. But again, long video here today. We're going through everything in 3 series, so definitely don't want to waste too much time on this intro. So without further ado, let's get into it. If you are new here, what we are going to do is go game by game in all 3 series, talking about the advantages and the disadvantages that each team was able to generate. I'll be giving a player of the game and a dud of the game for each game that we cover, and at the end of each series, I will be giving a player of the series to kind of tie everything into a nice, neat little bow. Of course, we will also be updating the bracket at the end of this video, and we'll be talking about some of the upcoming matchups, maybe what you can expect, who might be moving on, who might be doing well. We'll definitely cover all of that in terms of how I think the matchups end up going, because there is some interesting takeaways from everything that happened over the past couple of days. But again, most of today will be spent talking about the 3 series that we got this previous weekend. So without further ado, let's jump right into it. Our first series that we are going to cover is the lower bracket round number 1 series, and that means we are going to find out our first team officially eliminated from the LCS championship here in the summer split. It's a matchup between the number 4 seeded Dignitas and the number 6 seeded Energy. Of course, these are the 2 teams that ended up losing in the upper bracket round 1 with 100 Thieves and, of course, FlyQuest moving on to round 2. We will cover them more later. Both of these 2 teams ended up losing those matchups, and that means they face off in this first round of kind of the gauntlet-style lower bracket format. I really like this format for the playoffs. I think it really does ignite a lot of feelings for longtime LCS fans like myself because of the gauntlet style of it, but it means that these 2 teams, having lost 1 series in the upper bracket, now face a ridiculous uphill battle to try and climb, because you got to win like 4 or 5 series in a row against actual good teams here in the playoffs to even really stand a chance. And as for how they match up against each other, it's definitely a bit interesting. Dignitas are probably going to be coming in as favorites, I would imagine, just because of the consistency of some of the names on the team. I still really believe in players like Sven, and even to a lesser extent, someone like Jensen, who was kind of bad in their first round series, but Sven has been very much a positive for Dignitas. Jensen has been somebody that, especially going up against some of the bottom tier teams, the teams that Dignitas should be able to beat, he has been pretty great for them over the course of this split. I think he's been the most direct positive influence on their wins, even if Sven has definitely been their best player in their losses, certainly their most consistent. But it's the rest of this roster that does lead you to question whether or not this team has the same kind of upside as some of the other teams that are around them, or the teams that you would theoretically imagine they are on the same level as, because, you know, players like Licorice and Spica, they just have not been particularly good over the course of this year. Licorice has certainly not been that dominant of a top laner. Spica has really struggled in the jungle. He is much more of a late game team fighter, and so when teams really pressure him early, he can sometimes struggle to be able to keep up with that pace. I remember him for things like the Kayn back in the day, and so, you know, I don't know if this meta is entirely for him. He's not really an AP jungle player either, and so it's definitely one that I think Spica is just a bit out of meta, and it's really caused his performances to suffer. Even though we might imagine him to be really good on AP junglers, it's just not necessarily been the case statistically over the course of his career. But again, you have to imagine that they probably have the 2 best players in this series in Jensen and Sven. You know, Isles, I think, is generally fine. The bot lane has been up and down. When they do struggle, it's often because of Isles instead of Sven, but they often succeed in the 2v2, and so I'm not really going to sit there and blame Isles too much. I think he's been better than Licorice and Spica over the course of this split, but again, it's really just about their carry duo. If those 2 players step up, they're probably going to win, and if they do get good performances out of Licorice or Spica, or if Isles completely pops off, then I think you're likely looking at a situation where they win regardless. So Dignitas certainly probably favorites coming in, but Energy, I mean, they've got some experience being the underdogs in a playoff run and ending up making it work as they did last year in the summer split. Of course, this roster had a lot of high expectations coming into the year. I had them number 2 in my preseason, like in my January power rankings. They've obviously not lived up to that really at all for a team that ended up making the quarterfinals at Worlds last year and changing very little, only their support in a position that I think on paper you look like you upgraded in. It's really not an ideal situation, but things have just kind of fallen off the rails. The macro in particular for this team has not been great, and I think generally they're just all kind of out of meta. Palafox has really struggled recently in being able to go up one-on-one against a lot of these other more aggressive mid laners. He's really not the most consistent marksman in the world, and so in this meta where AD carries in the mid lane are just super common and super valuable, you end up not finding a meta where Palafox looks all that great. He much prefers things like the Yone and even like the Akali, even things like the Jace that he's pulled out in the past. Those have been his most common champions, and none of them are particularly good in the current meta, at least in terms of the matchups against the other more common mid laners right now. And then you got to talk about Dokla in the top lane. We talked about Licorice. Dokla has also not been particularly good. He has really good stats. Like when you look at the numbers, the stats look really good, but it doesn't show up on the eye test. I don't think his year has been particularly great. I think he's benefited a lot from being very good in lane, very bad out of lane, and that's just kind of the meta that we're currently in. And so I don't think Dokla has been particularly great regardless of what the stats say. FBI and Huhi have at times looked good. I think for the most part, they've been like the consistency of this team, even if they've not been like huge highlights. And Contracts, I think, is loved by the community. He gets a lot of, like, oh, it's not Contracts' fault type of comments on a lot of the games. I've not necessarily seen that. I think he is kind of the feast or famine part of this team. When he wins, they look really good, and oftentimes they're able to win games, but that's not really been all that consistent for him over the course of this split. I don't think he's been a particularly big positive for them over the course of this split, and so that being said, like, again, Dignitas are favorites, but we just talked about, like, 8 of the 10 players in this series. Like, you don't feel great about it, and so it can genuinely go either way. If you get a great series out of, Contracts and FBI and Palafox and players like that, yeah, Energy can win that, like, super easily, especially if Palafox and FBI are just better than their opponents on the other side. Then they're probably favorites in this series. So with that being said, the only way to know how this series ends up going is, of course, to check out the games and to go game by game. And that means starting off with game number 1. So let's get right into it. The winner of game number 1 was Dignitas. They are going to take the first game of this series. They're going to go up 1-0, and this looks like a clean game. On paper, you can kind of take a look at some of these stats and be like, oh, Dig kind of obliterated them in game 1, and I think there is some validity to that. I think their early game was so much better than Energy's. I think Energy's macro and decision-making in this game was just dreadful, like truly atrocious, and it really put them back into a really bad situation going into the late game, but I do think Dignitas tried their best to make it a lot easier for Energy to win this in the late game with some of their bad decision-making and just general lackadaisical nature in terms of how they want to close out games in a clean way. That being said, again, they took advantage of the bad Energy mistakes early, were able to get a pretty big gold lead, and then never really looked back from there. Player of the game for me is super easy. This one's going to go to Isles in the support position. This Senna looked completely broken. Like, I don't know if this is something that just has to be permabanned the rest of this series, but I don't think Energy had a single response to it. This is one of Energy's most played champions over the past, 2 years. I remember this was something big for them in their playoff run last year when they made that big run to win the finals, but it's just a completely different story when it's on the other side here. It feels like they have absolutely no answer, no response to it, and it's really bad for them in that case because Isles clearly knew how to pilot it, clearly knew how to take advantage of this weird lane swap that Energy did, and just, actively got super fed and ended up being someone that you couldn't actually take down in the later half of the game. So credit to Isles, the Senna looked amazing. Sven, obviously, kind of the damage carry to really prop that up. It really was the Kalista Senna that ended up popping off. A lot of that because they just got to lane into a Poppy the entire game, which makes it a lot easier, but bot lane looking really good for Dignitas. Definitely the standout members here. The rest of the team was fine. I thought Jensen, Licorice, Spica, they did their job. They weren't necessarily in a bad spot. Licorice in particular, I thought did a good job of trying to survive that lane swap early on, playing into MF, playing into Rel. It can be a bit difficult for the Cassante, but honestly, Cassante's one of the champions that deals with lane swaps probably the most consistently, and so I don't think he was worrying all that much. The only other major concern is, of course, Spica just deciding to 50-50 that Baron at the end of the game when they're up so much gold, when they can literally just fight and kill and not have to worry about it. He still got the smite off, and he still was able to get the Baron, but it never really had to come down to that. We almost had a Dignitas Baron incident in the first game here, and that would have not been particularly ideal, but again, Spica still was able to get that off, and they were still able to win the game. That's really the only major concern when it comes to Dig. Again, I would rather than just be aggressive enough to go and take the fight and try to win it and just not worry about trying to flip that objective, but at the end of the day, it ended up working out, so what can I say? And then for Energy on the other side, just not a good game. Like, honestly, I don't think they played particularly well here in game 1. I think that is indicative by the scoreline and by the stats that you see on your screen. There just wasn't a lot of positives to take away from this for Energy, in my opinion. Dud of the game, it's got to go to one of the 2 bot lane members, either FBI or Huhi. FBI is going to get it for me because I just don't think he did anything this entire game. The MF bullet times have to be on point, and he just never really was in a situation or he had an opportunity to really do anything about them. Like, this champion should be free to execute on in the later half of the game, especially because Dignitas was kind of clumping around a lot of these choke points. This should have been actually a pretty easy to execute, Rel plus MF, style of engage, and you have things like the Lily on the Poppy to set it up as well. it just never happened. Like, FBI was never aggressive enough to be able to pull it off. Again, you lane swap to try to get this bot lane into a good position, and you still weren't able to do that. And then also you draft a Poppy on the top side. If you're going to lane swap, why are we drafting Poppy? I just don't really understand. One of the big pluses to Poppy as a champion is being able to win 1v1 early on and actually like shut down a lot of these high mobility champions, kind of like Cassante. It really makes him have to play a lot safer, and it kind of neutralizes the laning phase. Of course, Poppy does a lot in team fights as well, but lane swapping that into the bot lane, okay, well now you're taking away like 50% of the advantage of drafting Poppy in the first place. I genuinely just do not understand it. It felt like a very bad decision from Energy. Again, I don't know if it's the coaching staff or the players' fault or whoever is making this call, but like it's the wrong call. Like it's just the wrong call. They're not good at lane swaps, and they also didn't draft a comp that necessarily benefits from the lane swap, and yet they feel like addicted to go to it every single game like they did in the regular season. So just a weird game number one. The only chance you had of getting back into it was essentially Dignitas handing you a Baron, but even then, you couldn't really do it. So you got to come out and win game number two. Going down 0-2 in a best of 5, it's a death sentence. Having to win 3 games in a row is just a really hard thing to do, not only because like you're not particularly good, but because Dignitas can close out games. This is a team full of veterans. You don't want to have your back against the wall like that, but Dig, I'm sure, wants to close this out as quickly as they possibly can. So are they going to be able to do that? Well, the winner of game number 2 was NRG. They are going to take game number 2. They are going to tie up this series at 1 apiece, and you wanted to see something out of them in game number 2? Well, they gave it to you. This was a slaughter. I mean, truly, the numbers do tell the story here. This was never even remotely in the ballpark of being close. This was a domination from moment one. You wanted to see them lock in, play something a little bit easier to execute in the mid game, and, you know, just actually go out and dominate. Yeah, they did exactly that. And I say easier to execute. This is still a comp that requires some thinking and some forward planning, but they still were able to do that. They just got on comfort. For Dignitas, disaster of a game number 2. You got absolutely slaughtered. Energy was looking like the champions Energy, the quarterfinal world's Energy that we saw from last year, and you just were not able to stand up to that. I don't know what this means for the series going forward. This certainly adds a whole new wrinkle that I just didn't think we were going to get in a series like this, but it is still very fun and still very interesting to see. So let's go ahead and talk about it. Player of the game, honestly kind of hard just because everybody did so well on Energy, but I think it has to go to Huhi. I mean, this was a legendarily good Bard game. Bard's one of those champions that oftentimes when it's picked in Pro, it actually does really well because the only people that have the balls to pick Bard right now are the people who are really good at him. You see like Keria in particular over in the LCK, but Huhi, obviously very good at Bard. He's always been a really good Bard player, even when it's not meta, like it kind of isn't right now, and he was just able to show up and move around the map and constantly be a massive thorn in the side of Dignitas. They had absolutely no answer for him throughout this entire game. Not that they had an answer for anything. I mean, this was very narrowly a kill-less game for Dignitas, but Huhi was a big reason for that, just constantly creating problems and just playing the Bard to perfection. This is one of the more clean Bard games I've seen, specifically in the LCS, and then obviously you've got to give a shout out to the rest of the team. I think Dokla is the other player that I really want to give a big up to. You know, the Rumble has been a topic for conversation for Energy. He's obviously very famous for that champion because of the way that he torched G2 at Worlds last year on it, but he's kind of just been mid on it over the course of this split. It's been something that they've gone to relatively frequently, and it's not necessarily worked out all that consistently for him or for the team, but it definitely worked here, and you definitely got to give him pluses for that. FBI was excellent on the Jhin. I continue to be one of the biggest Jhin defenders. I still think Jhin is worse in a league like the LCS than it is in like the LCK and the LPL. I think the better your team is, the better Jhin is likely going to do because you do have to play around him at least to an extent, but you know, FBI is really good at Jhin, and when your support is super fed, then you can kind of get away with playing however you want on that champion. You know, Contract, Palafox, they were both good as well, but this was a slaughter for Energy. It never was close, and for Dig, you just have to kind of take your L and move on. You can't really dwell on this all that much because you're still alive in this series. Obviously, it's only 1 apiece, and so you can't sit there and be like, well, we just got completely obliterated, now what do we do? You have to just go next, and unfortunately, there's really not a lot to glean from this game for Dignitas because everybody just lost basically from moment 1. Dud of the game, it's going to all 5. I mean, I have to give it to 1 because that's how the format works that I've done, and I'm not breaking that format. That feels like kind of an unfair thing to end up breaking, but Really, it's all five. It's everybody that lost this game for Dig. Nobody played well. Nobody had any pressure. Nobody played any, that much better or that much worse than anybody else. The only reason I'm giving dud of the game to Licorice is because he wasn't involved in the only kill that Dig ended up getting, and the Skarner just was not useful throughout any of the games here. Skarner is something that the LCS has continued to go to even after a lot of the nerfs. It's one of the, I think we're basically the only region that is still actively trying Skarner, both top lane and in the jungle, which we will get to later on, but it didn't work out here. I mean, Dokla got very fed on the Rumble, as you would expect in this 1v1, and Licorice couldn't even do anything in the late game. This Skarner just got absolutely trounced, and so genuinely nothing else for me to say when it comes to Dig. There's just not a lot of analysis I can give. This is going to be one of the shorter sections in this video, because everybody got obliterated. Sven and Isles got destroyed in the 2v2. Spica and Jensen got destroyed in the middle of the map. Licorice didn't get involved in anything throughout this entire game, and so it just kind of is what it is. You have to, be willing to accept, okay, yeah, we lost here, but we can bounce back in game number 3. In game 3, a very important one to bounce back in. You guys know that if a series is tied up at 1-1, I believe game 3 is the most important game of the series, not only to establish momentum and confidence, but because winning both of the final 2 games is infinitely harder than just winning one of the final 2 games. And so a big game number 3 for both of these teams. Who's going to be able to take it? Well, the winner of game number 3 was Dignitas. They are going to take game number 3. They are going to go back up in this series 2-1, and this was chaos. I mean, this was chaos incarnate. This really wasn't like the first 2 games, both of which the winning team just looked a lot better than the losing team. Game 1, Energy looked horrible. Game 2, Dignitas looked horrible. I think both teams looked both good and horrible in this game, depending on who you looked at, and that's already an improvement for both of them, I would say, over their losses. So maybe there is something positive to take away from this, but this was not a clean game from either of these teams. You can actively look at maybe even more people on both of these teams that wanted to lose this as hard as they possibly could, and a couple people on each team that wanted to win this as hard as they possibly could. This was Licorice trying to beat all of Energy. This was Palafox trying to beat all of Dignitas, and Dokla was trying his best to lose it for Energy, and Jensen was trying his best to lose it for Dignitas, and we just ended up in this state where it all just came down to who had the strongest champion, and unfortunately that was Cassante. And so Licorice is going to get my player of the game. He was awesome. I'm not going to put it all on Cassante. You still have to pilot that champion well, as we've seen before, and honestly, this might be his best game all split. I can't remember a time where he was able to just kind of dominate in the late game quite as much as he was able to dominate here. That's not to say he's been miserable in every single game, because that's not the point I'm trying to make. What I'm trying to say is he doesn't really have those big, pop-off, game-breaking performances that maybe he would have had last year. And so we've kind of been waiting on those, and this was definitely that. The top gap in this series was absolutely ginormous for Dignitas. I do want to give a big shout out to Sven as well on the misfortune. No setup in this game. I mean, we'll talk about Isles in a second. He did not have a particularly good game on the rel, and there is some concern that Isles is just not the kind of player you want as an engaged threat on the team for Dignitas, because other players just do it a tad bit better. But Sven, on this misfortune, really, really solid. Very happy to see how this ended up going down for him. Again, he's been the consistency piece for them throughout basically the entirety of the year. But again, that's not to say that everybody on Dig ended up performing well. Jensen and Isles were horrible, honestly horrible. I very narrowly gave dud of the game to Jensen in the mid lane because he just got completely obliterated by Palafox. This Corki has been a champion that has been unstoppable in a lot of the other regions. You look at the LPL playoffs, the champion had a 9 or a 10 game win streak for a lot of that playoff. You look at the LCK right now, Corki is absolutely dominating there. It's just not had the same level of success here in the LCS, and so when you see Jensen essentially be given a free opportunity to try and carry the game in terms of damage, you're going 40 minutes, you're playing Corki, and you can't outdamage a Talia on the other side of the matchup. It's about as bad as it could possibly get, in my opinion. This is just not a good look for him. He wasn't great at all against 100 Thieves, got really outplayed in that series and hasn't looked good here. Again, we already talked a bit about Isles not looking great. Isles' big strength as a player last split, the reason he was actually someone that I was pushing for a lot as a support going into this split is because he was so good in the 2v2 in lane. He's not really this team fight engage threat on things like Rel. I think they've just completely missed the mark on how to use him individually as a player. Their 2v2 is very good, but they need to be able to do something with him outside of that, and they're asking him to do too much in the area of the game that he's just just not very good at. But Licorice, certainly good enough to be able to win this game. Sven, obviously good enough to win this game, and that was enough for Dig, because Energy on the other side, they also had some down performances, we'll just say. And I think almost all of it is Dokla in the top lane. I mean, he just wasn't very good. This Poppy is looking like an absolute bait for Energy in particular. I think this champion is so broken, so busted, so strong in the current meta, but if they are constantly going to use it to try to match the misfortune in a lot of these laning phases, then yeah, you're taking away basically everything good that Poppy does in the early game. Not only that, but Dokla was just constantly out of position. He tried his best to shadow and monitor Sven in a lot of these team fights, but honestly, all that did was open the door for Licorice to be significantly more useful in the back half of this game, because the Cassante was just moving everywhere. There was no way for this Poppy to be valuable. Again, if you would rather give dud of the game to Jensen or to Isles, I do kind of understand that, but to me, the losing side kind of gets a little bit of bias in terms of dud of the game, and Dokla was by far the worst player on Energy in this game. I think the rest of the team was generally fine. Like, Palafox was really good on the Taliyah. This was a game-winning type of performance from Palafox, who has been a lot better so far in this series. He's certainly been better than Jensen through the first 3 games, but just wasn't enough. I think Contracts was also generally fine, was maybe a little bit less aggressive than I would have liked him to be in the back half, but still, I think he was at least trying. FBI and Huki were along for the ride. They weren't as good as Sven. Like, FBI wasn't as strong as Sven, but I don't think they were the problem at all. Huki actually had a couple of good engages on the Alistair to try to set things up. But again, the problems for Energy, they just persist in the inability to be consistent in these late fights, and the fact that they just shoot themselves in the foot with some bad decision-making basically every time throughout the game. And so they're now down 2-1 in this series. They have to win game number 4. If they lose this, not only are they eliminated from playoffs, but of course, that's the end of your 2024. That's not how you want to go out here. You don't want to be the first team eliminated from playoffs as the team that won the finals last summer. But for Dig, you're 1 game away from being able to move on. It's just the start of a gauntlet run, but I'm sure they do not want to let Energy back in this series with a win here. So are we going to be going to a Silver Scrapes game number 5, or is Dig going to be able to close this out in 4? Well, the winner of game number 4 was NRG. They are going to take game number 4. They're going to tie up this series at 2 apiece, and we are going to a Silver Scrapes game number 5. This is what I wanted to see, 2 teams that have their lives on the line, their year on the line, battling it out tooth and nail, and it kind of was a little bit boring through the first 2 games, but games 3, games 4, they have very much breathed some life back into this series and made it just as interesting as we could have hoped. This wasn't quite as close as game number 3 was, because game 3 really felt like either team could theoretically win it. They had superstar carries on both sides. This definitely was a lot more favored in Energy's corner, but this still was a good game from Dignitas, and I don't think that they were inherently awful throughout all of this. We'll talk about it as we move forward. There were definitely a couple of players that stood out in a good way, but for Energy, they finally went to the well, and it finally worked. The lane swap actually does work if you're swapping into Poppy and into Ashe, and you're trying to get your Smolder super fed. This is the kind of draft and the kind of circumstance where that actually can be super effective for the team, and it did end up really working out for them. They got a lot of gold in the early game and were able to kind of snowball that. Their team fighting was much more clinical in the later half of the game. It basically was a super fed Smolder and a pseudo fed Azir going up against an Ashe, and like, yeah, that's definitely going to be in favor of the Smolder in terms of damage and in terms of consistency in a lot of these fights. But it's not the Smolder that I want to shout out as my player of the game. It's going to go to the setup for the Smolder. It's going to go to Contracts in the jungle on the Skarner. I've said for a while, I still do believe this Contracts gets quite a bit more favor with the community because he is so liked as a player than maybe his gameplay would necessarily deserve. He's a good player. I'm not going to sit here and try to take that away from him, but by the way you hear people talking about him, you would think he's a top 3 jungler in the league. He's just nowhere close to that, or at least he hasn't been over the course of this split. It's been a pretty big regression over what 2023 was, I think very similarly to a lot of the other players on this team, but when it does work out, when he does have those good games, they still look pretty phenomenal for him, and that's kind of what we saw here. He's just a very feast or famine player, and you kind of have to live with that if you're a Contracts fan. But we talked about this a bit earlier. You know, the Skarner, definitely something that the LCS is a little bit less willing to let go of than a lot of the other regions, and they're even bringing it into the jungle in a lot of these games, and honestly, it really worked out in this one. Really not a pick I would expect to be all that good if you were to pick it consistently in the jungle. It's why I don't think we're seeing it all that much in the LPL and the LCK. It just doesn't really do a lot of the things that are important right now out of that role nearly as well as some of the other picks in that role, but it still does its job. And if you want a late game, setup specialist for your Smolder, for your Azir, for whoever, right? Like, the Skarner is going to be able to execute on that. And that's what Contracts did. This was a very good game, but I think it got better and better as it went along, which is definitely a good sign. But FBI, of course, the damage carry on this team. The Smolder was unstoppable in the back half of this game. The damage that he was able to do was excellent. This was Contracts and FBI as a duo really elevating energy to that end goal. Palafox also looked really good for a majority of this game, and then Jat had to go and open his mouth, and all of a sudden he's caster cursed into being horrible. The rest of this game, walking up and dying for no reason, overextending, being kind of a weak link in the later half of this game for energy. That being said, he was still fine in the early game, and I don't think he was nearly as bad in the back half as some people are going to give him credit for, but, definitely wanted to see him close this out a bit more, considering he has been just better than Jensen across this entire series up until this point. But Dokla, Huki, they were fine. Huki in particular, I thought was very good on the Maokai support. Another thing that I want to see more of here in the LCS. I think it can be very proactive, but again, just understanding your win condition a bit better here. They're going to the gameplay and the decisions that they've made over the past couple of series and games and saying, well, what if we just drafted around playing that style instead of forcing that style on drafts that aren't necessarily advantageous in that? And it ended up really working out for them. And then for Dig on the other side, Sven tried his best. He still continues to be the heart and soul and the consistency of this Dignitas team, but nobody else here was really all that good. Licorice was okay on the Poppy. He got put in a really bad circumstance at the beginning of the game and ended up working his way out of it into being useful, but Jensen and Isles continue to be negatives, like pretty big negatives for this team. Isles is going to get done of the game, but once again, like I said last time, you can very reasonably give this to Jensen as well. Those two players in particular are single-handedly holding Dignitas back, and for Jensen, that's really concerning because he was the one that was the most important in their wins in the regular season, at least in my opinion, and the Hui was just not it. He continues to lose 1v1 in terms of resources to Palafox, even when gifted so many resources by his team, but it's Isles who just can't land a good engage to save his life that really ends up being a bigger negative for this team overall. Again, I just continue to think they're using him out of position and out of role. I'm not saying that Isles is a player that I'm going to go tooth and nail to defend. I don't think he's particularly been good over the course of this summer split, but I do think he's better than what he is showing right now, and they're just not really allowing him to do the things that he's good at. There was a reason that Tomo and Isles as a bot lane was one of the scarier 2v2s in the league last split, and that's because they actually were picking things that were good in that area, trying to win 2v2, and putting Isles on Nautilus and on Rel. It's just not the kind of things that he is particularly strong at, even if they are meta at the current moment. So I still think that Isles can be a good player, but when you ask him to do the things he's not good at, of course he's not going to be particularly good at, and of course good at it, and of course I'm going to criticize it, which is kind of where we're at here. But Jensen's got to be better. Sven and Licorice have been good, but the rest of this team has to come together. Their macro has to be more concise and more consistent. It's the final game here. One of these teams is going to lose this game, and they are going to go home, and their year is going to be done. It is literally win or, not exist. Like, it is that much on the line for both of these teams, but only one is going to be able to win it. So who's it going to be? Well, the winner of game number 5 was Dignitas. They are going to take game number 5. They are going to take this series 3-2, and they will be keeping their hopes alive. You never really know what's going to happen going into next year. Dignitas's future as an organization is certainly not clear, and it's definitely less clear than Energy's on the other side of this matchup. We're pretty confident that Energy will be returning next year as an org, not so much for Dignitas, and so this definitely has to mean a lot for them as a victory. But for Energy, this team that just came off of last year going to the quarterfinals of the World Championships, for them to just be an easy out in the playoffs, it's really not ideal. And I think there are people giving a lot of credit to this team for how they played in this series. There are some things to definitely look at in a positive light, but there are some things to criticize as well. They probably should have won this game, and they just couldn't because their late game is not nearly as consistent as any of the other good teams here in the LCS, and that's really what ended up holding them back. So let's go ahead and get into it. Player of the game and player of the series as a whole is going to go to Licorice on the top side for Dignitas. Man, did they need him to have a series like this. Not only because Dokla has been pretty up and down and wasn't particularly good in this series, although was okay in this final game. We will definitely get to that, but they really needed him to just be someone that could be one of the scarier top laners in the league. We've talked ad nauseum, honestly, on this channel about how there's really only been 2 actually good performing top laners over the course of this split. it, that being Impact and that being Thanatos. Like, Whippo at times has been in that conversation, someone like Sniper at times has been in that conversation, but if Licorice can just like get to even like 75% of what he was last year, he's gonna be a top 3 top laner, basically with no question. He was very good here, was very good at absorbing pressure and not necessarily being a problem for Dig when he didn't have the resources, and did a really good job of being a positive for Dig when he did have the resources. This was just a good series, and the Rumble game kind of capped that off here in game number 5. I do think he was the most important player to Dig, although I very much considered Sven for player of the series here as well, if only because, again, he's just the consistent member of this team. I was really hyping him up before the summer split. I was talking about how I expected him to come in and be, you know, what he had been for Cloud9 and TSM when he was an AD carry for both of them, which is borderline top 1 in terms of AD carries in the region, but never really having those, like, great games, just being the guy that you can rely upon to be good in the 2v2, good in the team fight, like that jack-of-all-trades AD carry that he really made a name for in terms of how he played at the beginning of his career. And quite frankly, that's exactly what he has been for Dig, the jack of all trades, master of none type of AD carry. And that is a very, very valid way to play the game right now in the current meta. So I thought Sven was really good in this series at just being good enough, not being the problem for Dig. There still are some concerns. Isles was not good once again here on the Rel. Put him on an enchanter, like I swear, just like Bard or anything, like Karma, Renata, any of them. Like, it's just not, Rel is not it. Nautilus is not it. It's not how this guy likes to play the game right now. And I think you should try to be capitalizing on what he's good at rather than trying to force him to do the things that he is bad at. Captain Obvious, right? Like that should be obvious to anybody involved. Jensen had his best game of the series here in game 5, but you know, we'll talk about that. You know, I feel bad for Palafox because he was absolutely the better mid laner in this series with the exception of this 5th game, but people are really only going to remember this 5th game. People are going to talk about it as if this was some sort of miserable series from Palafox, but honestly, Palafox was probably one of the more consistent players on Energy in this series, just outside of this game number 5, so I'm really not feeling great about Jensen after how he played here. Spica was kind of irrelevant, quite frankly, throughout a majority of this series, was just along for the ride. When it came to Dig, wasn't the biggest problem, was also not the biggest solution, but they're just going to be happy to be able to move on. It doesn't really matter how you get there. You have to get those victories, and lucky for them, they were able to do that, and they will be moving on in this lower bracket, but Energy's season is over. This is the last that these players will play in 2024. Obviously very disappointing considering the expectations, but not entirely surprising considering how the regular season ended up going. This was a below 500 team making it into playoffs after all. They certainly weren't expected to be a team that ended up like dominating or really like stepping up in any meaningful way. They tried to make this series close. Contracts is going to get a lot of, I guess positive comments from a lot of people. I thought the Skarner was good in this game. Not necessarily great, but good. I thought Doklo was pretty good on the Kennen. Maybe a bit over-aggressive. FBI and Huki were fine, but Palafox just not so much. He's going to get dud of the series. It's really sad, or not dud of the series, dud of the game. I don't give a dud of the series. That's not necessarily fair, but he's going to get dud of the game for game number 5. It's really sucky because I think the first 3.5 games of this series were like really good from Palafox. Games 2 and 3 in particular were both like excellent Palafox games, and the beginning of game 4 was really good, but then you look at, the 1.5 games that he played game 5 and the back half of game 4, and all of those games sucked. Like the end half of game 4 where things started to go wrong, basically all of game 5. Like, it's unfortunate that during the most important parts of this series, that's when Palafox probably played his worst, but again, I don't think he actually played all that bad if you look at the series as a whole. It's just, again, very unfortunate that it all happened at the end. FBI and Huki were actually really good in this series. Huki in particular was excellent across this series, but people aren't going to talk about that. He was definitely the better support. FBI is somebody that I will continue to defend. I would be shocked if he is not on like an actually good team next year, because teams are going to value his ability to play in multiple stages of the game. And like I said, Contracts, Dokla, they were very feast or famine. Contracts was generally good, I think, throughout this series. Maybe not quite as much of a standout to me as Huki was down in the support position, or even Palafox in the first couple of games. I think Contracts' highs were never quite as good as the other players' highs, but his consistency was pretty solid. And Dokla, like I said, very feast or famine in this game on the Kennen. The good plays were great, the bad plays were awful. You just have to live with it. Energy season is over. I don't think anybody is surprised by this outcome, especially after the regular season, but they're certainly disappointed. I think there was an expectation that this team could theoretically go on a run. It just was never meant to be, and now they are our first team eliminated from the playoffs. But congratulations to Dig. They move on. They take on the lower seed of whoever ends up losing in the upper bracket that we'll talk about later on in the video. We don't quite know who that is yet. We will by the end of the video, of course, but whoever they're facing, they're probably not going to be considered favorites in that matchup, because even in a win in this series, there still is a lot to work on for this team. But then moving on now to our second series of this video of the last weekend, and we get to move up into the upper bracket now, talking about upper bracket round number 2. There are a lot of reasons that this series matters a lot. Of course, winning this qualifies you for winners finals, which is already a really big step in trying to become the LCS champion. But of course, winners finals means a lot more in the LCS than it does in some other regions, because here it guarantees you a spot at Worlds representing North America. And so we're going to find out our first two Worlds representatives from NA after these two series. There are 4 teams fighting it out for 2 spots. Of course, the third one will be determined, as we go along, but the worst you can do in the playoffs, getting to winners finals, is 3rd place. So a lot on the line for all 4 of the teams here today, and we're going to kick it off with our top seed making their playoff debut. It's the number 1 seeded Team Liquid taking on the number 5 seeded 100 Thieves. And the reason that this series is very interesting is because 100 Thieves, honestly, as a 5 seed, is in the best form they've been in all year long. And I think that that's pretty clear. I think the addition of Tomo down in the bot lane has really increased what this team is capable of doing. And I'm really excited to see what they are going to do now that they're faced up against, like, a real piece of competition in Team Liquid. This is obviously not Dignitas from round number 1. They were able to 3-0 Dig, which definitely surprised me. I expected them to win that as I predicted in my full bracket prediction, but I certainly didn't expect them to dominate it in the way that they did. But it certainly gave them a lot of confidence going into this second series, this second round. If they are able to get some really good performances out of their main carries, anything can really happen in a situation like that. I think Tomo being the big addition for this team actually does create a lot of interesting scenarios for 100 Thieves. Not only was Tomo one of the only ADCs last split that actually could go toe-to-toe with someone like Yan in lane. One of Tomo's big strengths as a player is his ability to 2v2, and that's obviously Yan's, like, bread and butter. It's what he's been able to dominate on in the LCS at, doing. But, bringing a secondary carry like Tomo into the team for 100 Thieves allows Quid to be a lot more active, and it allows him to play a lot more risky and aggressive, because typically speaking, when we're talking about 100 Thieves from the beginning of the year, it's either Quid or it's bust, right? Like, either he gets fed and he wins the game, or they're not really able to do a whole ton of damage. It's really a lot of the games were up to Quid getting really far ahead. And so now that you have someone like Tomo that you can rely on to actually win you games, not only at the beginning, but, he's a pretty good team fighter as well, it takes a lot of the pressure off of Quid, which I think is a really important kind of piece of the puzzle here. River obviously should be a pretty big asset. He's not been nearly as good in summer as he has been the past couple of splits, but honestly, there is a world in which he is just a better jungler than Umti, at least from a, mechanic standpoint, an early game standpoint, so we'll see how that goes. And I really don't hate the rest of this team, but the concern is that Team Liquid is so much more than the sum of their parts, right? Like, they are elevated so much by playing together, and the sum of their parts is already really good and already probably better than 100 Thieves. So we talked about Yan and Core JJ kind of being the best bot lane in the league by a pretty considerable margin. A lot of that is because they just don't really lose 2v2. They're not the kind of 2v2 that ends up, like, giving over pressure easily, even when they're in losing matchups. Oftentimes this team will draft, like, scaling 80 carries. The Double Dragon was very famous last split because they know that Yan will win the lane anyways, that it genuinely does not matter what champion they end up picking, that he's going to be able to walk out of it with a gold lead. That's how good these two have been in the 2v2, and so if Tomo is not able to step up and really match that, then that actually takes away a big advantage that 100 Thieves already has, and so we'll see how that goes. Of course, the other big matchup to watch out for is Impact into Sniper. This could be really bad for 100 Thieves. Impact is the most experienced player we have in the LCS. Sniper, obviously a rookie here for 100 Thieves, and Impact is very likely your MVP winner. I'd be very shocked if he doesn't go and win MVP. The form he is in right now, he's just been able to dominate everybody that he's been playing against, and that is definitely one of the matchups that I look at and see it as very Team Liquid favored. APA into Quid. APA was one of the only mid laners that I think was more valuable and more consistent to his team than Quid was over the course of this split. And so I don't think it's a particularly great matchup for 100 Thieves. I honestly think that I would feel better about them going into both Cloud9 and FlyQuest, but here we are. They have to face Team Liquid, who has been probably the best team in the LCS over the course of this year, and we'll have to see how they end up making it work. But the only way to see how they make it work, or if they can make it work, is to go game by game, and that means starting with game number 1. So let's get right into it. The winner of game number 1 was Team Liquid. They are going to take the first game of this series. They're going to go up 1-0. And yeah, this is about what I expected from the first game of this series. It was just kind of a dominating effort from the better team here. Team Liquid comes out and just kind of looks super strong to start off this series, and it's through the players that you would expect to really take over. Not that it wasn't everybody, but it was Impact, it was APA, it was Yan, the 3 main carries, the 3 main stars right now of this team in terms of what they've been able to do so far in 2024. You're just not shocked by this outcome. I think think more notably, though, is just the inability of 100 Thieves to actually stand up to some of the pressure that Team Liquid was able to generate in this game. A couple of these players played really, really poor, and we're going to talk about that. There are some potential weak links on 100 Thieves in these big series against some of the best teams, and we'll just have to see if that is something that does end up getting exploited more and more. But Team Liquid definitely exploiting it at least a little bit coming out at the start of this series. Player of the game pretty obviously has to go to Impact. The very likely MVP is continuing to dominate here in the playoffs. You know, a lot of people are talking about how ridiculous it is that Impact is playing as well as he is right now because this guy, you know, he won Worlds over a decade ago. 2013 was his World Championship, kind of his pseudo-rookie year on SKT, and now he's still here in North America playing some of the best and most direct League of Legends he's ever played. I can't really remember a time where he's been able to win 1v1 nearly as much as he's been able to do over the course of this year. It's really been kind of a big change in playstyle for him. He's always been a great team fighter and a great macro player, but being able to dominate individually is something that is a bit newer to the back half of his career, and I almost would say that he's gotten better in that regard over time, which is just insane. It's almost unfair that Impact feels like he is still growing as a player in year like 11 or 12 of his pro career, but he just continued to look awesome here. We'll talk about Sniper, but man, this was a gap in the top lane. Impact completely abused that rookie on the other side of this matchup, and that's what we were talking about in kind of the precursor to this series, kind of the preview, is that this could be very bad for 100 Thieves, and if there's one lane that I expected to just kind of be off the rails, top lane was certainly the one that I did not favor 100 Thieves in, and unfortunately that did end up coming to fruition here in game one, but it is Impact. You know, he's able to pick up ridiculous amounts of kills on Ornn and do, you know, solo kill, like full combo, like setup, team fight, whatever. He can do everything, right? Ornn is just one of those champions that if you're really good at him and if you're really good at the game, you can kind of pull off anything you want, but we'll see what happens later on in the series, because this kind of performance, if it happens again, like, it's doomed. Like, there is no recovering from that. You also want to shout out both Yawn and APA in this game for being able to set up a lot of things, or alternatively taking advantage of Ornn plus Vi plus Nautilus, a ridiculous amount of setup on this team in terms of engages and in terms of trying to create plays for everyone. Obviously, you have the damage as long as the Kai'Sa is online. You always will, but, you know, Ornn and Taliyah obviously offering damage as well. It's just kind of a ridiculous comp, and Yawn, APA, they executed it well. They didn't have to do as much in this game as maybe they would have in the regular season, but they still looked solid. Core JJ was great. Umti was fine. Didn't really have to do a whole ton. I continue to think that Umti is the one player on this team that I'm just like, yeah, he's along for the ride. Like, I don't necessarily think poorly of Umti. I don't know if I consider him like the top jungler in the league. I think he's pretty lucky that every single one of his lanes are just kind of dominating all the time. They're the best early game team by far in the LCS, and that makes it a lot easier to play jungle. But again, not trying to disparage him, just kind of trying to call out how good the rest of this team is. So you feel really good about that after game number one. And then for 100 Thieves, you know, not very good, not a great game number one, most specifically because Sniper just got brutalized. He is a very clear choice for dud of the game. There was just absolutely nothing he could do in this one. Impact completely outplayed him in and out of lane. Once the Renekton gets super far behind in this individual matchup, it is just completely doomed. We've actually seen Renekton not work out more than he works out, especially in a lot of the other regions. He was on like a 6 or 7 game losing streak in the LPL playoffs. Just not ideal. We continue to see a high priority on that champion in draft because he's very versatile. He doesn't need a specific comp around him. You don't really necessarily, like, you can play him on weak side or strong side. He's good in the early game. He can be useful in the later half of the game if you do want to get there. But the problem is if you lose on him as hard as Sniper did in this game, he does become an entirely useless champion, and that's why we're seeing him not be as effective as maybe some of these other more universal picks. And so we'll see how the development of that goes. You know, players like Tomo and Quid and Ayla, they weren't able to get anything done. Ayla in particular just had no inroads on the rel. He did not have a particularly good game. I don't think Quid played particularly well, but how much are you really supposed to be doing on the Smolder in the situation where the rest of your team is getting destroyed? Like, Tomo was way too far forward in a lot of these instances on a champion that, you know, really should be a lot more protected than maybe he was. It's not like River was doing anything to take advantage of Umti being a bit slower than the rest of his teammates. It just was fine, you know, I mean, it was just Team Liquid dominating. Like, there's nothing else to say. 100 Thieves was never really in this game, and they never really felt like they were going to be close. They have to turn that around in game 2. Going down 0-2 to Team Liquid is basically a death sentence. Having to win 3 games in a row against that team, nobody's even been able to win 2 games in a row against them over the course of this year, and so that's certainly a tall ask. But if Team Liquid can pick up this game to win, they are well on their way to getting where they want to go, which is being the clear team to represent North America at Worlds, and we'll see if they're able to do that. Of course, you know, game 2 is just part of that process, but they'd love to pick it up, and 100 Thieves would love to tie up the series. Only one of those things can happen, though. Which one will it be? Well, the winner of game number 2 was Team Liquid. They are going to take game number 2. They're going to go up in this series 2-0, and yeah, this is an appropriate slaughter. This game was, I would say, a bit closer than game number 1. There was at least some fight. I thought Quid obviously kind of got going on the Smolder here, which he wasn't able to do in game number 1, and so you're a little bit happier about that if you're a 100 Thieves fan, but honestly, this just looks like two teams that are not on the same level, and that is just unfortunate. It's just how it goes. Sometimes when you face the best team in the league, even if you are interesting near the middle of the standings, like Team Liquid is just a cut above everybody else right now, and we are continuing to see that. 100 Thieves is not eliminated or anything. This is a best of 5. They've still got one more loss to give. Theoretically, this could be the biggest reverse sweep we've ever seen, but at least through the first 2 games, it doesn't feel like that is going to be the case. Liquid looks amazing. I mean, they're just able to play through literally anybody at any time. Their mid game is just better than everybody else's. There's not even really all that much of a comparison. They're so active on the map. They are so proactive in trying to take control of the game for themselves. You know, I don't usually like to call out the coaching staffs because you just never really know what the coaching staff is doing, like behind the scenes. I don't get to see the coaches coach, and so I can't really evaluate them, but it is very clear that Spawn is just like the guy. He's been able to elevate Team Liquid challengers for so many years in the NACL, and now he's doing it for Team Liquid. He's getting the best out of all of these players that at one point in time were looked at as overvalued or under, you know, performative for their hype levels as prospects, players like Yawn and APA. And it's just commendable. Like, Team Liquid is just the premier team in the LCS for a reason. Player of the game is going to go to APA on the Talia. Just a beautiful game. I mean, it's genuinely hilarious looking back at some of the comments made about APA going into this year, because I was a big APA fan last year. If you guys followed the channel, you probably knew that. Like, coming out of Worlds and even just generally coming out of the LCS, I was talking about APA as a pretty clear, like, top 4-ish mid laner, like 4 or 5, like somewhere in that range. I felt was relatively fair, even though you were seeing a lot of conversation around him be, you know, a lot worse than that. And I was definitely one of the people defending his champion pool, where you had a lot of people talking about him as a Ziggs and a Cassio 2-trick and, you know, an Aurelion Sol like player. Like, that was exclusively what he could do. But obviously growing into this role, he has always been able to play a lot more than that. And I guess that's just what I knew from watching him for so long in, you know, tier 3 and then eventually tier 2 and obviously now in tier 1. But it's really nice to see his growth into one of the more complete mid laners in the West, period. Like, end of story, regardless of North America or Europe. Like, APA is just awesome. He's able to compete with basically anybody 1v1, and he's so useful to the team in a macro role. He just has a really good understanding of where he should and wants to be at any given time. It's just really impressive stuff. He's genuinely turned into one of the scarier mid laners in the West. And then I want to give a big shout out to Core JJ. I've actually been a little bit lower on Core over the course of this split, which I think is kind of funny. I think a lot of people are attributing the fact that the 2v2 is so good to Core JJ, when that's never really been his individual strength, and it has always been Yawn's individual strength. Like, that is the reason I loved Yawn in Academy, when he was playing for Team Liquid Academy, is because he was just so good in the 2v2. Him and Ayla were like a dominant 2v2 duo, and obviously Ayla on the other side of this matchup now, but Core always a lot more comfortable as a roamer, as a playmaker, and that's kind of what they've unlocked in the back half of this split. This game right here, like, Rel was everywhere on the map. When I talk about mid-game prio and then being able to grasp mid-game pressure, a lot of that is through Core JJ. This game, it was through Umti as well, who I thought played really well on the Sejuani. Just a lot of really good stuff. Top lane continues to be a massive gap. I mean, Sniper is just not having a good series, and Impact is taking advantage of that, but Team Liquid's Team Liquid. They look great, and 100 Thieves, unfortunately, just don't really have the firepower to match up. Like I said, Quid looked good, but one of the reasons this team was really struggling for a lot of the regular season and why they couldn't exactly jump like the top 4 barrier last split either is because they were kind of a one carry team. They had Quid and no one else that could really step up and dominate these games. They were really hoping that that was going to be Tomo, and honestly, I was pretty, you know, excited for that. I thought it really would be Tomo, but he was awful in this game. He very narrowly got my dead of the game. Just horrible positioning on the Misfortune, very low damage, just not a particularly solid performance, in my opinion, from an AD carry that is really important to 100 Thieves, but once again, dead of the game is going to go to Sniper in the top lane. It's just not looking particularly good for him. I don't want to rag on him too much, because I'm sure he's under a lot of stress in this position. This is a very high-profile game, and a very high-profile series. Obviously, they're one series away from Worlds, and that's a big one in its own right, and so I can imagine the pressure that he is under right now, but it is just not happening. Like, Sniper has been really horrible in the first 2 games here. He's just been completely outplayed by Impact, who is the best top laner in the league, but still worth noting that he's just been completely outplayed. And if Tomo is having a bad, game or bad series, River's really just not been that guy in summer. He's really not even been that much of a positive to the team at all. I actually think he's been pretty bad for this team in summer. It reminds me a lot of the year that he was on Dig in spring and looked really good, and then went to Golden Guardians in the summer split and just like completely obliterated. Like, his gameplay just fell off a cliff. It's kind of the same thing here, where I just don't even think River's been like a top 4 or 5 jungler in the league. He's just not been relevant in that way. If you're not getting those kinds of performances out of those players that you need to step up, and Sniper is also playing bad, it's just kind of doomed. And so 100 Thieves, obviously, their back is up against the wall. I think their goal at this point is to not get swept. If they can win Game 3 and just at least take a game off of Team Liquid, I think they're going to be happy about that. But TL wants to get this done and dusted. They are 1 game away from qualifying for the World Championships. Obviously, that's always been the expectation for this team, but now they can make it a reality with a win here in Game 3. Are they going to be able to do it? Well, the winner of Game number 3 was Team Liquid. They are going to take game number 3. They are going to clean sweep this series 3-0, and they have officially moved on to winners finals here in the LCS, and that means they have qualified for Worlds. This is not a shock, not a surprise to really anybody who was kind of waiting on this. We all expected them to make Worlds. I guess we all thought it was going to be maybe a tad bit more difficult than this, because they didn't need to drop a game in order to do it. But yeah, this team really is that damn good. They play around their strengths so well, and there is a reason that basically every single one of the games in this series against 100 Thieves, who, while they're maybe not the most terrifying team in the entire league, they're certainly not the biggest pushovers either, and I do think they've gotten better. There is a reason that all of these games ended up being super easy to win for them, and, their win conditions became increasingly obvious over the course of this series. Player of the game and player of the series as a whole is very obviously going to go to Impact to me. I think Broadcast gave it to APA. I get it. The Ziggs was a problem here, and the Talia was very good in game number 2, but come on, man. Like, it's Impact. He had like 50% of his team's gold in this game, and I get it's Gangplank, but like, come on. Like, Impact is absurd. I'm honestly, like, I'm high on Impact. I'm named him my MVP. Like, I'm acknowledging how good he has been over the course of this split, but even I was like, he's good, but is he like that much better than everybody else in the league? This was one of those performances where you're like, I don't know if anybody can ever beat him. Like, this was just unfair. We'll talk about Sniper. He got brutalized in all 3 of these games, but Impact just looks phenomenal. I mean, Gangplank is, in my opinion, his signature champion. I think like that and Jax are like the 2 that I think about the most when it comes to Impact, but really it's the Gangplank. Over the course of his career, this has been the one that he has basically always gone to, regardless of whether or not it's in meta. We've seen it pop up a lot in the LCK over the past few weeks. It's playable, I guess, at the moment. I don't think it's particularly good, but Sniper certainly didn't get to share in that sentiment in this game, and hell, all of 100 Thieves did not get to share in that sentiment. They tried to dive Impact again, as they did in game 2. Guess what? It didn't work out. Like, it just doesn't work. He 1v3s every single time, so Impact's unreal. Like, APA was great, and obviously the Ziggs is like an auto win for this team. They were able to take like 18,000 towers, if my math is correct, over the course of this game, and none of them were able to be contested. Like, all of them were entirely free. This champion just does so much by himself, and obviously, like, he had help this game, but APA was ridiculous, at least in terms of the macro. Yan, Core, they were all really good as well. There's honestly just not a lot of analysis that I can give. I'd love to sit here and try to talk about, like, oh, looked great on the Sejuani 2 straight games. Yeah, it's his best champion. He got a lot of advantages in the early game, and his solo laners dominated. Yeah, Yan and Core looked great. Okay, they're the best bot lane 2v2 duo in the entire league going into a Smolder Leona. Like, yeah, they kind of decimated that laning phase. Like, there's really just not a lot of analysis that I can even give you. This just was a slaughter. Team Liquid barely had to work to win this, and that's not even because 100 Thieves are that bad, but honestly just because I think Team Liquid is so much better than all of the teams that aren't like Cloud9 and FlyQuest in the league. It really is such a gigantic tier gap. It's like 2 full tiers in between Team Liquid and those other teams, and so definitely kind of insane to watch, but you got to give credit where it's due. Team Liquid was awesome in this series. And then for 100 Thieves, obviously this is a very disappointing way to lose in round 2, but your playoff life is not done yet. You just move down into lower bracket, you expend that extra life, and we already know where they're going to slot in because Dignitas won the previous series, and because both Cloud9 and FlyQuest are higher seeds than them, they will slot in against Dignitas in this lower bracket gauntlet run. That's an okay place for them to be, but they're going to have to turn around some of the mental from this series, because golly, this was bad from them. Quid was good, and that kind of tends to be the general trend. Like, Quid just always plays well for 100 Thieves. He's really unlocked a version of himself that doesn't even need all that many resources anymore to be a prolific carry for the team. It was just everybody else. I talked about Tomo being a pretty big letdown in this series. I think specifically Game 2 is where it stood out in a really negative way, but he just didn't do any damage over the course of this entire series. They really rely on him, like I said, as that secondary carry to take some of the weight and the pressure off of Quid and even off of like Sniper and River to really do something that Meech just wasn't able to do, and Tomo was awful in this series. Completely outplayed at basically every single avenue. Really not ideal. Ayla wasn't better. Like, they just got destroyed in the 2v2. River continues to be a complete non-factor for this team in the jungle. Again, I'm very low on what River has been so far in the summer split. I honestly don't even bring him up all that often. Not because he's, like, getting destroyed. He's not losing as much as someone like Armeo was in the regular season, but, man, he is just not winning. Like, I can't remember an early game where I walked out being like, River played that so well, and now 100 Thieves are in a really good spot because of it, and that's really disappointing. And then dud of the game, once again, is going to go to Sniper. I mean, just a miserable series from him, and I feel bad because it's against Impact, and you have to imagine not all of it is his fault, but at the end of the day, he had to be better. He had to be able to, at the very least, survive on the top side, and he just wasn't able to do that. This just was not close. Sniper is going to have to turn around his fortunes against Dignitas, but they've already beaten them once. They've already shown that they can beat them, and they swept them in round number 1, so you have to feel at least some level of confidence going into that series, but I'm sure a lot of that confidence ended up equalizing itself out. We'll end up seeing what happens there, but like I said, congratulations to Team Liquid. They have officially qualified for the World Championships. Again, this is not a surprise. This is not a shock. This is the one team that we expected most of all to qualify for Worlds. I think top 3 do feel pretty clear at the moment. We obviously don't know what's going to happen in the series after this, but Liquid being the first team from North America to qualify for the World Championships is definitely indicative of how things have gone this year. They were undefeated in the regular season, coming off of a very good MSI performance, a really good Esports World Cup performance. You're very excited about what Team Liquid can offer on the international stage, and I think the scary part is they've gotten better over the course of this year. I think they are incredibly versatile. They have a lot of different styles that they can play because they have a bunch of different styles of players on this team, and there really aren't a ton of like obvious flaws. I'm really excited to see what happens to this team moving forward because they really are NA's best hope in a while. But then moving on now to our third and final series of the video and our second of the upper bracket round number 2 series. We know one of the teams to qualify for Worlds out of the upper bracket here. We are going to learn our second at the end of this. It's the number 2 seeded Cloud9 taking on the number 3 seeded FlyQuest. And the reason this series is so interesting is because we have been talking about the LCS as kind of a big 3 league where the top 3 teams are all kind of a clear cut above everybody else, or at least that is kind of the anticipation going into the playoffs, but it has felt like Team Liquid is just a tier above everybody. It's not necessarily been how I've analyzed it throughout a lot of this year. I think Cloud9 has been a team that I'm expecting to get better over the course of this year, and to their credit, they kind of have. They've gotten better basically series over series, and there's a lot of reasons to believe that this is going to be a positive for them, not only because they beat FlyQuest the last time these two teams played at the end of the regular season, not only because that was so recent, and obviously I'm sure that's in both of these teams' heads, but also because I think matchup-wise, like, Cloud9 on paper matches up really well into FlyQuest. I think you're looking at Quad being like really good in lane, like 1v1 in particular for FlyQuest, not really needing a lot of resources to get ahead, but also not really sacrificing a ton in order for the rest of the team to get ahead. Jojo, not really been that over the course of this split. He's really been like more of a facilitator for the rest of the team, and I think that's honestly helped them quite a bit. I think Jojo's maybe had his worst split ever as a starter, but it's kind of ironic. He's the only player on this team that I don't think has been incredibly good for C9. They have a first team all-pro player for me in Vulcan. I really do think he's been the best support in the LCS in terms of adding wins to his team over the course of this split. That being said, we've seen some inconsistencies from him in the past, especially in series where teams can target him individually as a player. So we'll see what ends up happening here. I'm pretty optimistic that Berserker and Vulcan are on the right track as a duo, and quite frankly, they should just be better than Masu and Busio as a duo. I think that Cloud9 should definitely have the upper hand in the bot lane. And then in the top lane, that's where things get a lot more interesting. Thanatos was definitely better than Bwipo in the regular season, and you would expect that to continue, if only because Thanatos has this reputation as like this young gun that's supposedly supposed to get better over the course of this season. But, Bwipo, I just can't imagine that his form is going to stay as up and down as it has been over the past couple of months. He's really not been all that good, quite frankly, as a top laner in the LCS, and it's just not what I would anticipate from a player like Bwipo. You have to imagine that he's either going to figure something out or turn something around going into into playoffs. He has been a pretty clutch performer in the past for teams like Fnatic and Team Liquid, and so you're not really worried about him, like, dying in the playoffs, like, completely giving up all of his form. That being said, there really isn't a lot of form right now to give up. You just have to hope that he's going to be able to play up to his own standard in this playoff series, but at least from what we saw in the regular season, I definitely think Thanatos was the better top laner. The jungle matchup is obviously the matchup of the series. When these two junglers go head-to-head, it's always going to be kind of the one to watch. In my opinion, these are very clearly the two best junglers in the LCS. I'm big on the Inspired train. I have been for a very long time. I get that he's not the flashiest player in the world, and that sometimes his style can lead to some weird gaps in the early game because it's just really not where he wants to put a lot of his attention, but in terms of consistency, he has proven year over year over year that his style, the way he plays the game, and the things that he prioritizes can make a very consistent winner. And, you know, he's been an MVP contender basically every single season that he's played at a top level on Rogue, on, you know, Evil Geniuses, on FlyQuest. It hasn't really mattered where he's gone. He's been a top-tier player basically everywhere. So you feel good about Inspired, but it's Blabber. I mean, Blabber might be the NA GOAT. Like, he's certainly in the conversation. He's one of the most accomplished players to ever play in North America in terms of championships and MVPs and all-pros, accolades, if you will. But, you know, there's always been this lingering cloud because he hasn't dominated in the same way that players like Doublelift and Bjergsen were able to in their primes. I think this is an opportunity for him to elevate a team that people are expecting to be, you know, at best second and you know, in that second, third cluster to potentially be better than that. And that could be Blabber's big thing, right? Like, I think that he absolutely has the talent to do so. You guys know I'm a big fan of Blabber as well. And so, obviously, the jungle matchup is definitely the one to watch. I think if one of these junglers is just better than the other throughout this series, I think that will likely just determine who ends up winning it. But there are a lot of factors in this series from both of these teams. Cloud9, to me, very clearly coming in as favorites. I think they would be disappointed with the loss. I think their expectations are crazy high. FlyQuest's maybe not as high because they lost to Cloud9, but this is a team that definitely wants to make worlds. That's really the expectation for Whippo and Inspired and a lot of these more veteran, experienced players. So we'll see if they're going to be able to do that or if Cloud9 is going to be the team to qualify alongside Team Liquid. The only way to know is, of course, to go game by game, and that means starting with game number 1. So let's get into it. The winner of game number 1 was Cloud9. They are going to take the first game of this series. They're going to go up 1-0. Weird game 1. Very, very weird game number 1. A dominant early game for Cloud9, which honestly might be something you can anticipate from a playstyle perspective in this series. FlyQuest, really not the most aggressive early game team. In fact, of all the top teams really in the West, I think they are probably the slowest and the most passive in terms of where they want to play their early game. FlyQuest, very much a 5v5, like let's wait it out until late game type of team, so long as Whippo isn't just running through people in the early game. It's just not really their style, and so when Cloud9 comes out and starts winning early and starts really dominating in that phase of the game with Blabber and Berserker playing really fast and aggressive, I think that makes a lot of sense. Blabber, a much more early game focused jungler than Inspired. Berserker, definitely a lot more of an early game focused AD carry as a player, and when you're drafting stuff like Misfortune, that definitely plays into that, but it wasn't any of them that really separated Cloud9 in this game. To me, it was Thanatos in the top lane, and this is a very clear choice for player of the game for me. Thanatos was excellent on the Cassante. He has been getting better and better. I was lower on Thanatos in the Challengers League. Again, as somebody who watches the LCK in the Challengers League, you know, regularly, I was not seeing the same thing that Thanatos was being hyped up as. You had been hearing over and over again from every LCK commentator that Thanatos was like the second coming of Jesus Christ, and I just didn't see it. Like, he was a very good top laner, but he had clear flaws. He was a phenomenal laner in the Challengers League, but really struggled to be able to convert anything into like macro late game advantages. He was often in the wrong place at the wrong time. He could sometimes get a little bit tunnel visioned in terms of targeting squishies in team fights and not necessarily, you know, do the role that he needed to do. If that was peel, if that was, you know, just hold the line. Like, there are a lot of roles that top laners can have in 5v5, and sometimes Thanatos would just get a little bit over eager. I think those were things that he needed to clean up on, and quite frankly, those are things that he struggled with at the beginning of his time here in NA on Cloud9, but over the last, especially like 3 weeks, he has cleaned up on all of that. He has become a much more well-rounded, versatile player. It feels like the coaching staff has done a very good job to take his skill set and say, hey, we know you're a ridiculous mechanical talent. We know you can play a lot of these champions at a very high level, and we know you know the matchups, but we need to kind of get you on path to communicate better with the rest of this team and to play for these 5v5s, because that's where NA really is, like, that's what's going to make or break you in North America. Like, it's always been the case. You have to be a good team fighter in order to succeed in this region, and Again, Thanatos has only been getting better there. I think this was a big example of the development and the strides that he's made in that area of his game, because this is not the kind of game that he would have popped off on like 3 months ago. I don't see that. So it's really nice to see Thanatos getting better and really developing that part of his game. Like I said, Berserker looked really solid, but there are some concerns here. Dud of the game is actually going to stay on the winning side, and that's because we didn't really talk about it. Cloud9 came dangerously close to completely throwing this game, and there was a real concern that they were just straight up going to lose it. And there really is no reason for them to have ever been in that position after the early game, but Vulcan is going to get dud of the game. I genuinely don't know what he was thinking in the mid game. We talked about it. Vulcan has been so much better over the summer split than he really has been at all, like in spring or even last year. Like, there has been like a steady decline in terms of Vulcan's gameplay that felt like it was completely turned around this split. That did not carry over here into game number 1. They were able to win in spite of him, but Vulcan really created a lot of issues for this team, and that's not going to be sustainable. If he's going to play like this the rest of the series, that's going to be a problem for Cloud9, but Blabber, he was fine. Thanatos and Berserker really pushed them over the limit, in my opinion, and like I said, Cloud9 looked generally good in the early game, enough so to just be able to take advantage of Fly's weakness in that part of the game, but they gotta clean up some of their mistakes. Fly is too good in the later half of the game for you to be throwing things away like that. And then for Fly, the problem for me, for them, is just their slowness, right? That's the reason I've not really believed in them as a top 2 team over the course of this split, because I think both Cloud9 and Team Liquid have shown a propensity to just win early and really not give the enemy team a lot of opportunities to come back. You know, Cloud9 maybe a little bit less so, as we saw here, but I just don't know if Fly's style of play is going to be all that good against a team like Cloud9, or teams that actually do have these big mechanical advantages. At least here in game 1, that definitely showed itself to be true. You drafted things like the Smolder, you drafted like the Ivern, you really wanted to play for these front-to-backs, but you never got there. Like, Quad was in a good spot, Inspired wasn't completely out-jungled or anything like that, but you just never had the tempo in this game, and by the time you hit that late game, you were down in gold, you were down in pressure, and you were hoping and praying for Cloud9 to give it over to you, and they almost did. Like, let me get it straight. They almost gave this game over to FlyQuest, but it wasn't really FlyQuest doing that created that. It was more so Cloud9 making mistakes rather than Fly getting themselves back into it, and so there are a lot of things that I think this team needs to work on. Their scorelines look good, but again, I just don't think this was a particularly good game 1 from either team. I feel good about a couple of members of Cloud9, but I want to see them clean that up, and if they can go 2-0 to start this series, that's big. If Fly can even things up, obviously that's super important. Going down 0-2, 3 games in a row against Cloud9, it's just a hard ask. It's always going to be a hard ask, so winning game number 2, very important for Fly, but it could be very, very crucial for C9 to get that mental advantage. Can they keep their foot on the gas from their regular season victory, or is FlyQuest going to be able to pick up a win here and even up this series? Well, the winner of game number 2 was FlyQuest. They are going to take game number 2. They're going to tie up this series at 1 apiece, and yeah, this is what I hoped we would get. I would hoped we would get some back and forth series, not one where one team just comes out and kind of dominates and looks better. I wanted a back and forth between 2 of the better teams here in North America, and so far, we have kind of gotten that. Cloud9 continues to stick to the narrative, and FlyQuest, quite frankly, still continues to stick to the narrative. It feels very defined, the roles between these 2 teams in this series. Cloud9 is going to be the team that wins early. They are going to be able to get their early game advantages, and FlyQuest is going to be more clinical in the late game because Cloud9's just not very good in that stage of the game at the current moment. And so we get these situations where whichever part of the game ends up being more valuable to these teams is what ends up, winning out in the end. FlyQuest ends up taking game number 2 because they're able to get their late game scaling comp online with the Smolder more so than they were able to in game number 1, but really there weren't a lot of changes for these 2 teams in terms of their approach, even in terms of the drafts here going into game 2, and so you're just really looking at whichever style ends up prevailing. Luckily for FlyQuest, it was the scaling that ended up working out for them here in this second game. Player of the game is pretty obviously going to go to Quad. I mean, regardless of whether or not you think Quad was the one making the big plays, he was the most important player in the game because that Smolder just torched Cloud9. Like, there was no answer, no way to deal with it. I see a lot of people on Reddit being like, well, why aren't they banning the Smolder? Now, in this case, I do kind of agree with them. Like, after game 2, I think it's very clear to see, like, okay, well, maybe just take that out of their hands. Force them to play something else. But answering Smolder with Corki is typically the right thing to do. Like, this is not like an anti-Cloud9 draft. Like, this is not, FlyQuest running over them in terms of, like, the pre-draft. It's one of those things where Smolder is a lot easier to pilot in North America, where these games are going a bit longer, where teams aren't quite as clinical in the mid-game at being able to, like, make Smolder suffer really as much. There's a reason in the LCK and the LPL we're really not seeing Smolder all that much, and even when we are seeing it, it's not like particularly successful. It can have its good games, trust me. People will point out like T1 lost to Smolder. Yeah, T1's lost to a lot this year, and so, you just kind of have to, you take the good with the bad, I guess. And for me, Smolder is just one of those champions that if you shut him down, he's super manageable. If you don't shut him down, he's going to take over the game, and that's kind of what happened here. If you don't trust your ability to shut him down, then yeah, ban him out. I think that's totally fine, but don't complain about the champion, because the champion is not broken, not in any stretch. Inspired was good this game as well on the Ivern. I think Ivern's just so valuable as a champion. Like, I've talked about this a lot in the LPL, because they've really picked up on the Ivern. Teams like Top Esports have played a ton of Ivern over the course of this year, but the difference between a really good Ivern and like a so-so any other jungler is just gigantic. Like, the things that this champion does that other champs just can't offer, it's quite ridiculous how versatile and how easy he is to execute. Masu and Busio were good. Busio in particular had a couple of great engages on the Rel, and honestly, Bwipo was really influential in the back half of this game. I would argue he was the second most important player in these team fights. You can argue that he can be feast or famine, that sometimes these laning phases don't go his way, and I agree, but man, when it hits in some of these fights, it really hits, and Fly just keeps kind of drilling that narrative in. We are the late game team, and it's kind of funny to watch. And then for Cloud9 on the other side, you just got to feel a bit disappointed. If there are things to complain about with the draft, it's not, oh, they traded Corki Smolder, because I have no issue with that. It's not the priority on Lilia or Cassante, because I'm fine with that. I really just don't like Ziggs for Berserker, and that's not to say Ziggs is a bad champion. Ziggs is very valuable. We saw that in the previous series for Team Liquid. We've seen a team like Billy Gaming, or even a team like LNG Esports over in the LPL, really be able to make the best out of bot lane Ziggs and move him around the map and just get every single tower, try to scale the game that way. But the problem is Berserker is so aggressive in terms of skirmishes, and that's really where he individually thrives as a player, that you're kind of taking that aspect away individually from him if you put him on the Ziggs. I would much rather the Ziggs go mid lane. I think JoJo's actually the kind of player that you would want on something like Ziggs right now, and then you could throw, I don't know, anything down in the bot lane, like Misfortune and Jhin were off the board, but Ashe was available. Ashe could be a pretty decent pick here. You're maybe lacking a bit of damage, but you can understand the idea behind what I'm trying to say of, I just don't know if Berserker's the player that Ziggs should be going on, and I'm really not sure this is the champion that C9 should be drafting, even if I do think Ziggs is in a really good spot right now. But again, you're just finding these situations where good early game for Cloud9, at the very least a solid early game, if you don't want to go as far as to call it good, and then horrendous team fighting. And I was hyping him up, but Thanatos is going to get dud of the game. This is kind of the problem, right? I talked about the development. That doesn't mean it's going to be perfect every single game, and you're going to get some games like this where Thanatos is actually in a really good position going into the mid to late game and just completely throws it away by team fighting so horribly. He was, quite frankly, really bad at this at the beginning of the split. I didn't think it was a strength of his game in the Challengers League against worse competition anyways, and so I really was not enthused about like him being put in that role in a lot of these games, and as much as I do think he's gotten better, it's clearly not gotten better enough to be able to offset some of the problems. I also think JoJo, who was like the only source of the team's damage, misplayed a lot of these fights. JoJo continues to have what I consider to be maybe his worst individual split ever. Something to monitor. Blabber was not good here on the Lilia. He didn't really get to do anything, and again, Berserker was the only one with any pressure on the Ziggs, because that's what that champion does, but he can't fight. He can't actually go out and skirmish. He can't push the lead forward for Cloud9. He can do a really good job of establishing the tempo and the game state, but he can't actively push forward with it. That's where JoJo and Blabber and Thanatos have to step up, and they just didn't here in game number 2. So a lot to continue to monitor here for both of these teams, but 1-1, you guys know what I'm going to say. It's the most important game of the series. Winning this puts you in such a dominant spot. You're going to have to, basically win 2 in a row, and that's really hard against both of these teams. So game 3, very important. Who's going to be able to take it? Well, the winner of game number 3 was FlyQuest. They are going to take game number 3. They're going to go up in this series 2-1 for the first time here, and we're really starting to see a pattern develop. If it hadn't already developed through the first 2 games, it's definitely a lot more clear here after game number 3. FlyQuest is going to be the more clinical team in terms of late game execution, and Cloud9 are going to make some pretty critical errors and mistakes over the back half of these games. It's just really frustrating. It feels like this team should be in a decent spot in a lot of these circumstances, and yet they make these horrible macro calls that just completely throw off the balance of everything that they are trying to do. I actually think social media, and this is going to be a shock to longtime viewers, has gotten it right in terms of the narrative with this series up until this point, because the narrative is FlyQuest is playing as a team in the late game. They're playing a little bit slow in the early game, which I think isn't ideal, but they are playing coordinated, and they're trying to make plays together as a unit. it, and Cloud9 is a solo queue team that is just like trying to run their head into a brick wall over and over, and if they're skilled enough, they're going to be able to win, but they're not. They're not that much better than FlyQuest, where they can just abandon all macro and abandon all communication and still be able to come out and win the game. And so it's frustrating. If you're a Cloud9 fan, you've got to be frustrated. If you're a FlyQuest fan, you got to feel good that you've been gifted this success rate. But like, to me, honestly, like, Cloud9's not putting up any opposition in a game like this. It's just a complete free win for Fly. I don't even, like, if I'm a Fly fan, I'm sitting there being like, well, at least I wish my team could prove that we could win in these hard situations. Cloud9's gifting it to them on a silver platter, regardless of the fact that FlyQuest doesn't have good early games. And so it is a bit frustrating to try and analyze, because there really isn't a lot to take away from it, but I'll do what I can. Player of the game is, once again, going to go to Quad. He continues to be kind of the damage carry for this team. Maybe I underestimated him a bit in the regular season. Again, I talk about this all the time on the channel. Longtime viewers are probably tired of hearing me say it, but I might be very biased when it comes to Quad. It is very difficult for me to analyze him because my analysis of him goes back for so long. I've been following him ever since he was Sulka on DRX in 2021, one of my favorite teams of all time, 2021 Spring DRX, when that was like this all-rookie team that was trying to make it. He was a very interesting mid lane prospect, and, you know, following through the Challengers League up to Nongshim over to FlyQuest Challengers, like, through his eras, he has always kind of stayed the same player, a very, I don't want to say selfish player, because that feels very rude, but like a resource-heavy player, somebody who is not going to play for his teammates. He's going to play for himself, and he doesn't really roam. He doesn't really move around the map. He's not someone that likes to skirmish early. I've always called him like Baby Scout. I think that's the best way you can kind of visualize him if you're familiar with Scout's gameplay over in the LPL. He's kind of like a baby version of that. But you get into series like this, and it really works out, because you get to these 5v5 team fights, and you've got an Ivern, you've got Inspired completely playing to try to enable him, you've got a Jhin that doesn't necessarily need a ton of resources in order to carry, and all of a sudden this Azir is like wide open. Like, now you can play almost exclusively through Azir or Smolder, or insert any late game mid lane carry here. This is why I wasn't like super in on the idea of like, oh, just ban Smolder, because there are plenty of options in the mid lane to be able to scale into the late game right now, and Quad just found another one and ended up outplaying Cloud9 on it. So credit to Quad. He was awesome in this game, in and out of lane, to be fair. Inspired continues to look really good on the Ivern. You know, Inspired's one of those players that can fit that facilitative role if he needs to. He's a lot more versatile in that respect than people give him credit for. Just because he's known as a bit of like a team fight carry and a resource carry doesn't mean he can't play Ivern and just like try to run it down the middle of the map, especially when they know they can target the enemy mid laner and they know they have an advantage there, which they do in a series like this. Masu and Busio continue to be under the radar very good, and Bwipo, you know, he's not the flashiest player in the world. Well, he is actually the flashiest player in the world, but that doesn't mean that every single play is going to work out, but the ones that do, they do end up working. FlyQuest, again, they just feel like a cohesive unit. They're not this band of dudes that are just trying to figure things out. They are a team, and that is very clear. Cloud9 are not at the current moment, and that was the problem in spring, and the thing that frustrates me so much is that it really did feel like that was getting fixed. Like, that was not the case in the regular season. Their late games had become a lot more clinical. They had started really translating their leads a lot better in the mid game, but all of that fell apart in this series so far, and you just have to wonder what is happening. Like, what happened between 2 weeks ago and now that caused Cloud9 to play so differently? Because I'm going to be honest, like, you know, Cloud9 beating FlyQuest in the regular season, okay, well, maybe FlyQuest leveled up in the playoffs. I don't think FlyQuest are playing all that much better than they did in the regular season. I just think Cloud9 are playing way worse, and that's super frustrating. Dud of the game is going to go to Jojo Pume. He's already kind of been the weak link of this team in the summer split, and that's carried over here. Like, the Corki, not all that great, and it's not just him. Like, Blabber, what are we doing? What are we doing trying to take Baron when you're at less than a quarter health on a Mumu? Like, it's such a mind-boggling decision, and every single thing that Cloud9 tries to do in the back half of these games, you just have to question why. Like, what is the thought process? Where are we going with any of this stuff? I don't understand it. I feel like they are constantly walking themselves to the corner and then being like, how do we get out of it? And all they have to do is just not do that. Berserker, I think, has been, I guess, fine. There have been a couple of plays that have been, like, stand out bad, but none worth, like, really harping on and noticing. Thanatos, I think, has been worse than he was at the start of the series, but not, like, so much worse that they can't win with it. To me, this was a mid-jungle gap, and that was the biggest problem, specifically a mid gap. This very much felt like a big mid gap for FlyQuest, and that's just not acceptable. Jojo is not the kind of player that is allowed to get away with something like that. So Cloud9's back is up against the wall. They might lose their first playoff series, go down into lower bracket, which wouldn't be ideal, but maybe it's good for them. Maybe getting more games in is something that this team actually needs, as long as they're still able to qualify for Worlds. But for Fly, they're one game away from being able to qualify for Worlds. There have been so many questions about this team over the course of this split. If they're able to answer all of them now, that's massive. So we'll see who ends up taking it. Can Cloud9 push us to a Silver Scrapes game number 5, or is FlyQuest going to show that they were actually stronger the whole time? Well, the winner of game number 4 was FlyQuest. They are going to take game number 4. They're going to close out this series with a 3-1 win, and they have officially qualified for the 2024 World Championships. Obviously, that's the expectation for this team. It's the expectation for both of the teams in this series, but FlyQuest able to get it done by being better here on the day. And honestly, as up and down as I've been on Fly, this is by far the best showing that they had because they just dominated. They came out and they obliterated Cloud9. Not even the early game was a problem in this one for them. They go for a more, I guess, like, old school comp. That feels weird to say. Like, Jarvan Orianna's not old school, but, like, you know what I mean. This isn't 80 carries in the mid lane. It's not like the current meta, right? It's a lot more regular League of Legends than what we've gotten over the past year or so, and it does work out for them. A lot of teams have really failed trying to play this style over the course of the past few months, so it's nice to see that Fly actually does have some success on it. But for Cloud9, oh my goodness, like, oh no, this is not good. Like, it didn't look good at all across this series. Even game 1, like, people are calling this a 4-0. It wasn't a 4-0. Like, they earned their win in game 1. They were the better team in game 1. They just tried their best not to be. That was more so Fly being bad as well, but this was a rough series for Cloud9, and I want to make something clear because I am seeing quite a lot of comments on this, and maybe there are some disagreements with this down in the comments section. I'm genuinely curious how people feel about what I'm about to say, but there's a lot of talk like, oh, where are all those people that said that Cloud9 was in the same tier as Team Liquid now? It feels like such a revisionist history way to look at it. Like, like the way I always put it is it feels like a scoreboard statement rather than like an I watch the games statement, because you go and watch the final series that they had against FlyQuest in the regular season. These two teams didn't feel like they were close. Cloud9 felt like they were definitely better than FlyQuest. It's not just, oh, I guess we were overrating Cloud9. It's something's happened to Cloud9. This was not the same team that ended up playing FlyQuest in that end of the regular season. There's so much more nuance to that conversation than just it was stupid to think that ever. And I'm not just trying to cover my own ass. Like, trust me, there are a lot of times that I'm happy to admit where I'm wrong, where I'm like, wow, I way over or underrated this team. But you cannot convince me. You cannot convince me that the final series that this team played in the regular season is the same as this play. That's the same team. You cannot convince me of that because they're not the same team. They're handling everything so much different. I don't know if they're tilted. I don't know if they're like just not prepared to play under the lights of the playoffs. Like, genuinely, I don't have an answer for you. But what I can tell you is that trying to compare this team to what they were 2 weeks ago is not even a fair comparison at this point, and we'll get into that more. But for FlyQuest, they looked amazing. I honestly think they looked great in this game 4. Basically everything you could have wanted out of them, they gave you. My only concern is that, at least in some of the other games in the game 2, game 3 win, it wasn't like Fly looking unbelievably good. It was more so Cloud9 looking bad that led to that victory. That's something that I think they'll have a chance to prove out of themselves up against Team Liquid in the next round, but it's something I do want to see moving forward. Masu's going to get my player of the game here for game 4. I almost didn't talk about him enough in this series. He really was awesome for FlyQuest. I think a big reason why Fly had such an easy time playing out some of these late game comps, as much as I want to give a lot of credit to the middle of the map, and trust me, I will in just a minute, was Masu and Busio just being the better bot lane. Vulcan really struggled this series. Man, we're going to talk about that, but even Berserker really didn't have that big of an impact on a lot of these games. Masu was just better than Berserker, and Busio was just better than Vulcan, and so you walk out of these games and you're like, wow, Fly's bot lane was better. That's like an insta-win. We talked about it in the preamble, kind of the preview for this series. We expected Cloud9's bot lane to be one of their more secure, like, winning lanes in this matchup, and they just lost. And if that's the case, that's going to be a disaster for a team like Cloud9. But player of the series is very obviously going to go to Quad in the mid lane. I didn't have to think about this. Quad was the best player in this series. Happy birthday to Quad. Pretty good birthday present. Pretty good series for him. But yeah, this is the upside of bringing someone like Quad in over Jensen, is you're going to have performances like this in the late game where he's just so mechanically talented. Now, does he have the same kind of breadth of game that someone like a Jensen has? Well, maybe. At this point, Jensen didn't look particularly good in their previous series, but like from a well-roundedness, like perspective, he's not very well-rounded as a mid laner. But man, if you get him into that comfort zone, if you allow him to just take over in these late games, like, yeah, he's gonna look amazing, and he looked amazing in this series. Inspired was a big part of that. The Ivern was a massive pick for Fly over the course of this series. I'm shocked it took Cloud9 until game game 4 to ban it out. You know, Bwipo had some really big highlight plays on the Renekton that they wanted to prioritize. It was okay from FlyQuest. As much as it kind of sounds like I'm dogging on them, like, it was a good series. I just don't think this team is all that different from what they were in the regular season. Like, that would be my analysis of it. If you're wondering why I think the result of this flipped from the regular season, it's not because I think FlyQuest got a ton better, but rather because I think Cloud9 got significantly worse, and that's probably been well articulated at this point, but it's everyone. Like, it was everyone. I mean, there's a couple of players definitely worth singling out. Vulcan was horrible in this series. He was probably their most consistent player in the regular season, or at least their most important. I mean, Blabber was up there too. It's either Vulcan or Blabber in terms of their regular season success, but for both of them to really fall off and have horrible series, it's not ideal, and I mean, it's hard to not bring up JoJo. Like, JoJo just has to be better. There is no other way to say it. If he's going to play like this the rest of the playoffs, they are going to miss Worlds. End of story. Like, there is no conversation surrounding that. It is entirely up to the performances that he is going to give them for the rest of the playoffs. And, you know, 4 games of Corki, one of the strongest champions in this current meta, and you can't do anything on him, it's really just disappointing. Berserker could have been better. He needed to be better than Masu, even with the rest of the team failing, and he wasn't. Like I said, Blabber not good. Thanatos was really only good in game number 1. Just nothing, like, there's nothing else left to say. The analysis that I've given is the most accurate that I can say. Cloud9 has now been moved down into the lower bracket, and they're going to have to rebuild their confidence. They're going to have to get back on track, because if this version of Cloud9 shows up the rest of the playoffs, they're doomed. They're not going to make Worlds playing like this. But for Fly, congratulations. I did not expect to say this, but they have now been the second team from North America to qualify for the World Championships. Of course they earned it. They were the better team today. I want to see how they do against Team Liquid. That's going to be a really big indicator as to whether or not this team is like a legit title contender, but at least for now, being a top 2 team, qualifying for Worlds, getting that checked off of your resume, guaranteeing top 3 at the very least, I think is a massive improvement for Fly considering what they were at times in the regular season, and I certainly think they're going to be walking out of this series feeling good. Alright, but that is going to do it for my LCS Round 2 overview and analysis. Video up on the screen, the updated bracket. After 2 rounds of games here in the LCS Championship, we know our winners finals. Team Liquid taking on FlyQuest. We also know kind of the order of our lower bracket here, of course, with 100 Thieves being the lower seed out of them, and Cloud9, they get slotted in to lower bracket Round 2. Cloud9 slotted in to lower bracket Round 3 by being the higher seed. Dignitas, by beating Energy, moves on to that Round 2, and so we know our final 5. 2 series to preview at the end of today's video. First of all, the winners finals, Team Liquid taking on FlyQuest. You know, TL are going to be massive favorites for this, and honestly, there's no reason to believe that they can't be. I didn't think Cloud9 was going to be able to beat them, and I already think that they have more upside, quote-unquote, than a team like FlyQuest. FlyQuest clearly has a higher floor right now because Cloud9 just can't figure themselves out, but I just don't think Fly has the firepower to beat a team like Team Liquid the way that they are playing. Impact has just been better than Bwipo on the other side. APA is someone that I trust a lot more than Quad, and even though I like Masu and Busio, and I think they've gotten better, Yan and Core are the best bot lane in NA right now, and so I feel pretty confident that Team Liquid should be able to get the job done. The only real advantage I think Fly could have is potentially Inspired getting really fed in some of these games, and perhaps Quad being, you know, good enough to be able to slow the game down enough and try to play for these 5v5s, but it's not like Team Liquid is bad in the 5v5s, especially with their drafting strategy, so I'm really not concerned. I think Team Liquid are big favorites, and it would be a major upset if FlyQuest ended up taking them down. But the other matchup, 100 Thieves taking on Dignitas, a rematch of upper bracket round 1. 100 Thieves was able to take it in a 3-0 sweep. I had 100 Thieves winning at the first part of the bracket and then Dignitas winning in the lower bracket. After seeing Dig play, I don't believe that anymore. I think 100 Thieves is better. I think Tomo has been a big addition to this team, and I think Team Liquid really is just that good that they can make a team like 100 Thieves look bad, but if their confidence is completely shot, that could be an avenue for Dig to get back in. One of the matchups to watch is going to be Sniper and Licorice. If Licorice got a bunch of confidence from that Energy series, and if Sniper lost a bunch of confidence from that Team Liquid series, perhaps we could see Licorice stepping up and being a really big factor in that, but outside of that, I just don't really see an avenue where Dig is just like better across the board. Sven has been such a dominating figure for them, an important consistency piece, and I think Tomo might just be like a higher cap player in terms of what you're expecting. And then I also believe like Jensen into Quid is Quid favored, and that's not good for Dig. So I have 100 Thieves moving on, and then I would have Cloud9 beating both of these teams unless they just completely dissolve, right? If JoJo continues to be bad, like Quid could absolutely beat JoJo Pune, and so that could be a bit of an issue. So we'll see what ends up happening. Obviously, next week is going to be very fun either way, so I'm excited for it. I hope you guys are as well, but that's gonna do it. If you guys enjoyed the video, leave a like. It really does mean a lot to me. Lets me know you guys are enjoying the content, and it does help get this video out to a lot more people, which I'm always very appreciative of. If you're new here, hit the subscribe button. Of course, we're covering everything LCS until the end of the year, but we also cover all 4 of the major regions as well. So that's LEC, LCK, and LPL. We also cover the NACL Tier 2 here in North America. Playoffs are ongoing there. That video will be out tomorrow, so if you're interested in a lot of that stuff, hit subscribe, hit the bell so you can be notified when those videos do go live. But of course, with all that being said, I hope you all are having a great day. I hope you continue to have a great day, and I will see you all later.